for this episode of Higher Dimensions. And today I want to talk to you about the shadow self and particularly Jesus of Nazareth. Did Jesus have anything to say about the shadow self? You know, one of the key people in modern times when you talk about the shadow is Robert Louis Stevenson, who wrote the book Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in the late 1800s. In the book, it illustrates graphically this idea of the social self, which is represented by Dr. Jekyll, and the shadow self, which is represented by Mr. Hyde, and the struggle that the character goes through to integrate those two parts. It's amazing how the author was able to use the story and literature to reveal to us our own human experience on an interior level. It's interesting in the Gospels and the teachings of Jesus, they have lots of external applications. You can think about things like caring for the poor, loving your neighbor, worshiping God. All of these take on external representations. But Jesus was far more concerned about what was going on inside. In one place he says, you know, it's written, you shall not commit murder, which is an external behavior. But he says, I say to you, if you curse your brother in your heart, if you call him a fool, or if you call him an empty head, that you're in danger of hellfire. He also says in another place that if you clean the inside of the dish, the outside of the dish will become clean as well. And so we can look at Jesus' teachings from both an external perspective in terms of how we function within society, but we can also glean some very powerful things when we look at it from an interior perspective and how we relate to ourselves. The other thing that's really interesting about the life and the teaching and even the death of Jesus Christ is that because he was the light, because he came from the light, because the light of God was shining through him so powerfully in the society of which he was a part, he was actually continually exposing both the individual shadow and the corporate shadow. And this is really the reason why he was ultimately rejected and martyred and crucified. So I just want to encourage you, when you begin to let your light shine and you begin to speak truth, if you're truly bringing light into people, oftentimes they're not going to celebrate the light that you're bringing, because sometimes you're exposing things that's in their shadow self that they themselves have disowned and projected and don't want to deal with. We particularly see this in the Gospel of Luke. Luke's Gospel uses the term sinner more than any of the other of the four Gospels. And the word sinner there is being used as much in a social sense as a theological sense. For Jesus, the sinner was not the person who was rejected or cut off from God, quite the contrary. In Luke's Gospel, the sinner is the person who has been judged by society, and Jesus, as God's representative, is going out to the sinner and bringing them in. So in Luke's Gospel, we read that the power structures, the Pharisees, the religious structures, were upset with Jesus because he ate with sinners and with publicans. It's in Luke's Gospel that we see the story of Zacchaeus, who had been villainized in his own community for his behaviors, even though he was prosperous and successful. Yet Jesus goes to his house and eats dinner with him. And when he eats dinner with him, a change takes place within inside of Zacchaeus. And the scriptures say that salvation came to his house. It wasn't salvation from something in the afterlife. It was transformation of his life and a reintegration into society. One of the most powerful stories in the scripture, maybe the most powerful story in the scripture, that deals with these aspects of ourselves is the parable of the prodigal son. I want to invite you to think about the parable of the prodigal son from an internal perspective of the social self, or the persona and the mask, represented by the son who stays home, and the shadow self, which of course is represented by the prodigal son who leaves. We miss some of the nuances in the story, and I'm trusting that you're familiar with it, because I don't want to take the time to read it, but we miss some of the nuances of the story if we read it strictly from the perspective of our own culture. Today it's not uncommon for people to take an inheritance and go and spend it on themselves. Going on a cruise, buying a house, buying a car. A lot of it depends on the size of the inheritance, right? But in ancient cultures, the reason a son inherited from the father was so that they could maintain the family structure and the family business in the next generation. It wasn't about receiving the inheritance so that you could go live and do some things that you weren't able to do before. It was about receiving the inheritance to keep the family intact and maintain the economy for the next generation. So when the prodigal son, the character in the story, comes and asks the father for the inheritance, it's beyond the pale of the social norms. And to make it worse, he takes the inheritance and he goes off into a far country, which means as a Jew, he went and associated with the Gentiles. Later in the story, it says he joined himself to a citizen of that country, which means he joined himself with the Gentiles. These things were unthinkable to a Jewish person. And then he took what was meant to maintain the economic structure of the family and collectively even the Jewish state for the next generation. He takes it and he wastes it on all kinds of what the scripture calls prodigal or wasteful living. He spends it on harlots, he runs out, and then ultimately he finds himself in this pig pen, which is absolutely unthinkable to the Jews because pigs were considered to be unclean. So the point I'm making is that to the hearers of Jesus' day, this is very much a radical, far out, demonstrative example of the shadow self. What the prodigal son does is not only unforgivable, it's completely unthinkable that anyone would act so irresponsibly. So this son goes out, he does these things, which is really the acting out of the shadow side of the self, and he finds himself at a point where the scripture says very powerfully and beautifully that he comes to himself. He comes to himself and he takes ownership for his actions. And he decides, I'll return to my father's house and I will tell him that I'm a sinner and that I'm no longer worthy to be called his son. And this is key, because the aspects of ourself that hide in our shadow are the parts of ourselves that we have deemed unworthy of any kind of love. And of course, you know the story. The prodigal son comes back, and instead of the father chastising him, instead of the father shaming him, the father runs out and embraces him and kisses him and then celebrates him, restores him, and has a party for him. Now, this upsets the other brother because the other brother, who represents the social self, followed all the rules. He tells the father, I've always been with you, I've always served you, I've always done the things that you've asked me to do. That's our social self, the part that wants to fit in, the part that wants to be loved, and the part that doesn't act out. And this brother gets upset at the father for the way he has celebrated and received the prodigal son when he comes home. And so interestingly enough, that son, the good one, the social one, leaves the father's house as well. He refuses to join the party. And the father, not content, goes out to that son also and pleads with him to come in and join the party because this part of the family, if you will, this other son, this brother who had been dead was alive again, who had been lost had been found. And the goal was to bring an integration and a reconciliation between the two brothers. And so we can understand the work that we do within ourselves with our shadow, not as it is transformative, it is incredibly powerful, and it will bring a level of wholeness and wellness and power to your life, unlike anything else maybe that you could do. But really what has to take place inside is a reconciliation between the parts of ourselves that we deem acceptable and put out there for love, and the parts of ourselves that we disown and hide. And so some of the keys that we can see in the story is that, first of all, we have to take responsibility for our shadow self. We have to come to ourselves and we have to tell ourselves, like I heard one friend tell me, we have to tell ourselves the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth about ourselves. And we'll often find that this brings shame, that our initial reaction will be, I'm not worthy of love. I'm not worthy to be called a son. But when we own that, we can begin to make our journey towards integration, which is really what the Father's house and the party represents in this story. And you'll notice that the Father does not chastise, correct, shame the Son at all. And so in order to do proper shadow work, we have to be willing to release all judgment and shame and guilt over those aspects of ourselves that we've kept hidden. And in fact, those aspects of ourselves, what they desperately need, what the shadow self desperately needs, is to be loved, to be accepted, and even to be exalted and celebrated. That doesn't mean that you take all the shadowy stuff and you go out and act on it. It means this isn't exterior work at all. This is interior work that we do with God, with the help of people around us perhaps, but it's something that has to be done only within our own selves. Only our own prodigal within us can make the journey home. And then these other aspects of ourselves, with God of course, and the divine aspect of ourself, has to love and embrace that part of us that comes in. And then ultimately the social self has to be willing to come back into the Father's house so that some kind of integration and reconciliation can take place. It's a powerful story. It's in the Gospel of Luke. I'd encourage you to read it. I hope you enjoyed today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it helps you. And again, whatever time you find yourself watching this, morning, afternoon, evening, or night, I hope it's good. Thank you for joining me. Please feel free to like, to subscribe, to share, to even comment, good or bad, or your thoughts, whether you think it's good or bad, in the bottom. Thank you for joining me.